The night of Saturday, the 3rd of May, would turn out to be Liverpool's worst night of bombing so far. The German aircraft concentrated on the docks and the surrounding area. It was a relentless, devastating attack. 2 miles from the docks at Mill Road Hospital, a parachute mine had scored a direct hit. Somehow, Dr. Leonard Findlay, the hospital superintendent, and his colleague matron Gertrude Riding had survived. But as the dust began to settle, they discovered the maternity ward, full of expectant mothers and women with their newborn babies, had been destroyed.
It was night time, there were fires starting, there were probably people screaming out for help, everybody running everywhere trying to work out what on earth they should be doing. So it was the stuff of nightmares.
For the mothers and their babies who'd been on the ward as the bomb struck, it must have been terrifying.
I have an account here written by a Mrs. Spencer, one of the mothers caught up in the events on that dreadful night. My baby started to cry, so I turned myself to the wall to feed her. Then this big woof came. I thought my ears had burst as the dust and glass came showering down. It was obvious we had been hit. The room was lit up by the fire above. The floor was littered by glass.
Earlier that night, Dr. Findlay had tried to move as many of the mothers down to the relative safety of the basement as he could. But not everyone could be moved. Whether they ran out of space or ran out of time, many mothers remained on the ward. Among those left behind was Elsie Haunch, who had given birth just days before to her baby, Joyce. They were in the maternity ward when the bomb hit.
I was born on the 26th of April.
Joyce is now in her 70s and recalls the tragedy of that night.
A lot of the mums and babies didn't survive. They were on the wrong side of the corridor. And that must have been dreadful for everybody else, mustn't it?
In the aftermath of the explosion, Joyce's mother, Elsie, only had one thing on her mind: to get out as fast as possible.
But Mum just picked me up and she ran as fast as she could. With the hospital falling down behind her, negotiating all sorts of debris. My mum and dad never ever spoke about the war. I think they were just so distraught. They just never ever wanted to talk about it. We were very fortunate. You can get upset about it, can't you, really?
There's no way of knowing the exact number of women who got caught up in the carnage of the maternity ward. We do know that at least 8 mothers and their newborn babies were killed.
A lot of mothers were killed, a lot of babies were killed, a lot of them were newborn babies. And that must have been a nightmare for all of them. Those that escaped managed to do so a lot of the time just helping themselves, scrambling out of the wreckage the best they could, and hopefully finding their babies, or otherwise searching desperately for them.
It was a terrible situation for Dr. Findlay and Matron Riding. There were people still buried in the rubble.
The call went out across the city for all available rescue, first aid and ambulance help. To add to the chaos, Mill Road's own ambulance depot had been destroyed, making it harder to move victims to other hospitals. Meanwhile, casualties continued to pour in from the surrounding area.
By 2 in the morning, help had begun to arrive. Several trucks packed with soldiers joined in the rescue effort, digging victims out of the rubble.
The rescue were carried on throughout the night because this bombing raid went on for 6 hours, and the initial bomb had hit quite early on. So if you can imagine, all the rescue work is going on while bombs are still coming around them. So it must have been a terrifying ordeal that the people were going through at that time, trying to fight the fires, recover the bodies, rescue people who they could still hear within the rubble.
It was a long and grueling night, and despite their injuries, Gertrude and Dr. Findlay worked through it, tending to casualties. At some point, Gertrude's wounded eye made it impossible for her to carry on, and she was taken to another hospital.
My father, despite his horrible injuries, stayed on duty for something like 36 hours. He would spend the whole time organising all sorts of aspects of rescue, recovery, etc., and trying to create some order out of the complete initial chaos.
They were digging people out of the rubble for hours. They rescued around 400. But 97 people lost their lives that night. Over at Huskisson Dock, Captain Kinley and his crew were battling on. Although they'd been forced off their ship by the fires raging on deck, they'd committed themselves to trying to save it.
Amidst the chaos along the docks, he'd found a group of exhausted volunteer firemen. The only firefighting equipment they had was a small portable pump and a couple of hoses, completely inadequate for the job in hand. But they followed Kinley back to the blazing, bomb-laden ship and began hosing down her hull. It was all they could do.
In the roads around Wycombe Street, the bombing was intense. Trapped in their shelter, Margaret Johnson and 3 of her children could hear the bombs pounding the streets above.
She must have been terrified for the safety of her children. Peter, age 15, John, age 7, and the tiny 6-month-old baby Margaret. The boys would likely have been up on very basic bunk beds like these, with the baby cradled in Margaret's arms.
I don't know what time the bomb dropped that took the house and the shelter out, but the shelter took the hit. They were trapped in the shelter.
Margaret and the 3 children wouldn't have known what hit them. A bomb had scored a direct hit on their air raid shelter. And in an explosion of concrete, twisted metal, corrugated iron and broken earth, the shelter collapsed inwards, burying everyone inside.
The air raid continued into the early hours. Not many would have dared to venture out to see what damage had been done by the German bombers. It would have seemed like an eternity for those waiting in the shelters. As the clock struck 5 a.m., the skies cleared, the planes were gone, the raid was finally over. But the people of Liverpool still had to come to terms with what had happened.
Joe, if you listen to me, watch this.
Remember,
Joe,
the
come
Johnsons were a big
watch.
family. They had 6 children, and not all of them were staying in the house on Wycombe Street that night. We know Margaret's son Jimmy was staying just around the corner with his aunt Frances. When the all clear sounded, Frances and Jimmy came out of their shelter and rushed back here.
Frances realised, her sister Frances realised that the bombs were dropping quite close to Wycombe Street and went to look.
All she saw was this huge crater, and she thought, my family are in there, you know.
It would have been a scene of utter devastation. 34 Wycombe Street was gone, as was the shelter in the back garden next door, where Margaret and 3 of her young children had taken cover.
Home in Wycombe Street.
In the immediate aftermath, neighbours
arrived in
had to
Liverpool
help
2
dig out
days
the
earlier.
victims.
Just now, in the chaos of his behaviour, soon discover the full extent.
In the darkness, Frances, Jimmy and the other rescuers dug through what was left of the shelter. Pulling away rubble with their bare hands, they uncovered the body of a woman. It was Margaret, unconscious and clearly seriously injured.
The night of
and
Saturday, the
clasped
3rd of May,
tightly
would
in
turn
her
out to
arms
be Liverpool's
was her
worst
baby
night of
daughter.
bombing so far.
Birth was Elsie Haunch, who had given birth.
My nan
know what
was
hit them.
pulled out.
A bomb.
and the baby.
It was Margaret.
And the baby was dead, Margaret.
The night of Saturday...
Auntie Fran said she picked her up and she looked like a little doll, fast asleep. No mark, no injuries or anything on her. She just looked like a tiny baby asleep.
She picked her up and she thought she's alive. But when she felt her hands, she was just ice cold. And my mum was absolutely devastated because this child was like a little doll. She was only about 5 months old, I think.
Margaret Johnson was taken to hospital. She was unconscious, and it's likely her husband Peter would have rushed to her side. Francis and Jimmy were desperate to find Peter and John. They hoped that they'd been dug out from the ruins and were sheltering somewhere.
As dawn gave way to morning, the people of Liverpool emerged to a smashed and shell-shocked city. But down in the docks, the battle was still not over. Captain Kinley must have wondered how long his ordeal would go on.
For hours, Kinley and his crew had been hosing down their ship, the Malakand, hoping to quell the flames, to keep it from blowing up. The men were exhausted. They'd been fighting the fires for over 8 hours. Then, the quiet of the early morning was shattered by a monumental explosion.
Captain Kinley's heroic efforts had been for nothing. All 350 tons of high explosives, the entire cargo of the Malakand, had gone up. Incredibly, that's almost as much as was dropped on the city of Liverpool that night. The explosion would have been immense. A witness on a ship nearby described a terrific noise coming from the docks, and the whole sky was blotted out with a dirty yellow fog. For a full minute, metal of all shapes and sizes came raining down. Neighbouring ships were smashed to pieces and sunk as pieces of metal tore through their hulls. One 4-ton anchor was thrown over 100 yards, and some pieces of debris from the explosion were found 2.5 miles away.
The blast was one of the largest explosions Britain had ever seen. And Captain Kinley and his men were only feet away when the ship went up. On the morning of the 4th of May 1941, the people of Liverpool woke to find smoke hanging heavy in the air and fires still burning across the city centre. Liverpool had just endured a night like no other. It was the most devastating the city had yet experienced. Between the evening of the 3rd of May and the early hours of May the 4th, nearly 300 German aircraft had dropped 350 tons of high explosives and 50,000 incendiaries down on the city. The human cost was immense. More than 1,200 Liverpudlians lost their lives that single night. Many hundreds more were wounded. Despite all the carnage, outside Liverpool, reports were sketchy, information thin on the ground. In London, the BBC merely said that the main attack that night had been against Merseyside, with few other details, other than that thousands of firebombs had been dropped but had swiftly been put out. In reality, the raid was on the same scale as the worst that had already been suffered by Coventry, Hull and London. During the Liverpool Blitz, a journalist, Arthur Johnson, kept an uncensored record of what happened during that week in May. Arthur Johnson Jr. is his son. What does it say about the Malakand?
Well, he devotes 2 pages in the diary to the incident, so it must have been very significant happening. In fact, he says one of the most fearsome incidents, particularly those living or working in or near Liverpool's Dockland. So that explains, I think, how important
It
it
obviously
was.
made a big impression on
It
him.
certainly did.
What does he say about what happened?
Without warning, the cargo of high explosive blew up.
It just went off, eh?
Yep, blew up. Captain Kinley was on the quayside, scarcely 100 yards away at the time. He felt the searing blast of the explosion and was thrown against the side of the shed. Pieces of debris struck him, inflicting head and leg wounds. Others nearer, and even some were further away, did not live through the experience. And it was in Captain Kinley's opinion that he was standing in the vacuum and that the blast spread over his head. Difficult to imagine, isn't it? And it woke up most of Merseyside as well. A huge explosion.
But Captain Kinley survived.
He did.
Even though he was so close to the explosion.
Yeah.
Captain Kinley had had an extraordinary escape. Others weren't so lucky. As the blast took place during ferocious bombing, it's impossible to say exactly how many were killed. Estimates suggest 30 people may have lost their lives. This footage of the aftermath shows the terrible damage caused by the explosion. The blast from the Malakand had resounded so far across Liverpool that the Gong family would have heard it 3 miles away in Chinatown.
Desmond, his mother Harriet, and father Fong had emerged from the shelter where they'd taken cover from the air raid the night before. They would have been totally shocked by what they saw.
All the surrounding streets, the heart of the oldest Chinatown in Europe, had been completely destroyed.
As they walked along Pitt Street, to their horror, they'd have seen their home, their restaurant, and their grocery store bombed to smithereens.
This remarkable photograph was taken only moments after the Gong family found their bombed-out home. Here they are, surveying the damage while standing on the ruins.
My father is the gentleman on the left of the three at the top of the pile of rubble. My grandmother is standing at the bottom of the pile of rubble, looking up.
The Gongs had lost everything they'd worked so hard for.
Like many families, they searched through the rubble for anything of value they could find.
As they combed the wreckage, they would no doubt have been contemplating their loss, completely unaware of the danger they were in.
They would have had no idea that there was an unexploded bomb under there.
When they returned later, that bomb had gone off. Now the rubble had been reduced to dust.
The bomb had exploded and there was literally nothing left.
The Gongs had lost their livelihoods, but they were still alive.
It's quite an emotional photograph from a family point of view, really, because that was the family business and the family home. This is the only record we have of what happened on that night in May 1941.
Across town, Margaret Johnson was lying in a hospital bed. During the night, she'd been pulled unconscious from the wreckage of the Wycombe Street shelter. Her baby daughter had died in her arms.
When Margaret woke up, she would have been told about the death of her baby daughter. I can't even imagine the grief she'd have felt. But there was worse to come. No one had any idea where two of her other young children, Peter and John, were.
Margaret's younger sister, Frances, never forgot that night.
She lived, Frances, till she was 96. To the end, she still talked about that night, even though she had dementia. She might not be able to tell you what she ate for her breakfast, but she could tell you that night, hour by hour. It was stuck in her brain forever. No matter what happened to her brain, that was there.
As Gertrude Riding woke that morning, her head bound in bandages, memories of the night before would have come flooding back. Doctors had been unable to save Gertrude's injured eye, which had been badly damaged when the hospital collapsed.
Her bravery and resilience are quite unbelievable. Considering what she just experienced, what she'd gone through, and to soldier on the way she did. You know, an incredible woman.
Later that morning, after his long ordeal, Captain Howard Kinley would have returned home to be greeted by his wife, Kathleen, and Martin, his 12-year-old son. Kinley had never been an emotional man, but we know he was visibly shaken.
He was obviously tired, but he managed to smile at me. My father was pretty resilient throughout life. I think he felt lucky to be alive.
Kinley wasn't the only one thankful to be alive. The previous night, film star Mary Lawson and husband Buster had taken a huge gamble and not gone into a shelter. Instead, they spent the raid alone together in 74 Bedford Street. When they emerged from the house that morning, they discovered their neighborhood had escaped serious damage. Maybe their luck would hold out.
Liverpool had endured 3 consecutive nights of bombing. The city had taken a real beating.
Liverpool had seen some of the heaviest bombing of the entire Blitz. And in Kirkdale, a severely injured Margaret Johnson was waiting for news of her missing sons.
And now, on May the 4th, people were seeing a city that had been utterly transformed by the bombs and the fires that had engulfed it. But the May Blitz was far from over. As the bombs continue to fall across Liverpool, the search begins for Margaret Johnson's missing boys. Film star Mary Lawson and her husband Buster must decide whether to spend his precious leave in the public shelter or risk another night alone together. And we meet Catherine Domingo, forced to cross the bombed-out city with her 2-day-old baby.